Following the Second World War, there are a number of war crimes trials which were held, and some of these resulted in the executions of military officers and generals. The most famous trials occurred at Nuremberg, with Hermann Göring and many other members of the German War Office and Nazi hierarchy being sentenced to death for their crimes. But in the Pacific Theatre, there were court proceedings brought against a number of Japanese officers who were involved in some of the most horrific crimes of the conflict. It's estimated that between 2 and 14 million civilians became victims of the Japanese army as they committed horrific atrocities in cities such as Nanking. They treated prisoners of war terribly, and there were terrifying stories and allegations levelled against them in regards to how they held prisoners inside of camps. But many of the Japanese officers who committed crimes would do so against Allied officers and airmen, and some of these were executed in medieval methods, using swords to take their heads. But one man who after the war was held accountable for a particularly barbaric war crime was Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, who was the commander of a Japanese garrison that committed great evil. But what is his story? Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of the Cannibal Japanese general. And remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Yoshio Tachibana was born on the 24th of February 1890, and following graduating from a private school, he attended the 25th class of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. He studied for a number of years and graduated in 1913, and he then became an officer. He would later be promoted to captain in August 1923, and he then the following year was given command of a battalion of the Japanese 12th Infantry Regiment. He would also serve on the staff of the 11th Division, and he was later sent to speak to high schools to boost numbers of soldiers. He then became a major in August 1930, then a lieutenant commander 5 years later. He was present as a liaison officer for the Manchukuo Imperial Army, but then as the Second World War broke out, he was given further command of more regiments. He took control of the 65th Infantry Regiment, which saw a lot of action during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Interestingly, in 1942, he was then assigned to the staff of the Hiroshima Regional Defence Command, and further promotion occurred. But in May 1944, he became the commander of the 1st Independent Combined Brigade, who were defending the Ogasawara Islands against American invasion. His final promotion came at the end of World War II, when he became a lieutenant general, and he took command of the 109th Division in the final stages of the war. However, by mid-1945, as the end of the war was looming, the Allied naval blockade was causing chaos and suffering to 25,000 Japanese soldiers on Chichijima. They were running low on food and supplies, and the daily ration of rice had been reduced from 400 grams per person a day to 240. The troops, because of this, were not at risk of starving to death, but Tachibana, who was commanding his soldiers here, would turn to cannibalism at the time. They were desperate, but what they did out of desperation was shocking and a horrific war crime. In late 1944, the Japanese had managed to shoot down a number of Allied bombing aircraft during bombing raids on Chichijima, and 9 airmen managed to escape from their aircraft before they were killed. They managed to get to the island, which was 700 miles south of Tokyo, and whilst here, Lloyd Woolhoff, James Dye, Grady York, Glenn Fraser Jr., Marvel Mershon, Floyd Hall, Warren Earl Vaughan, and Warren Hinderland were captured. They were held in tough conditions inside of a prison on the island, and they were subjected to terrible treatment. The men would be interrogated daily, and they were also beaten very badly, and they were tortured for information. One man who managed to evade capture during these bombing raids and attacks was the future American President George H.W. Bush, who had been shot down, and at the time was a 20-year-old pilot inside of the American Air Force. The American Airmen were held for a number of months, however the order was then given for Tachibana's men to execute them. It was specifically General Tachibana who gave the order and the execution instructions, and the men were to be executed by beheading. Interestingly, the story of one of the captives was rather different to the other men. I've omitted his name just because of this. It was said that this soldier was friendly to the Japanese captors, and he learned of a few words of Japanese. It was said he attended parties and drank sake with his captors. When American bombers appeared overhead, he ran into caves along with the Japanese. He had always been clever. This was a guy who worked his way up from enlisted man to officer, from cook to flyboy. Now he was teaching himself the Japanese language and customs well enough to use chopsticks and joke with his captors. Maybe he would be lucky, but then his luck would run out, as an order was issued to execute him also. The Japanese officials who became friends with him avoided being his executioner, but he was too beheaded like the other Americans. Shockingly, after his execution, it was said that his body was dissected by the island's doctor so they could examine his insides. His liver and thigh were removed too. At night the liver was pierced with bamboo sticks and cooked with soy sauce and vegetables, and served along with alcohol. It's believed that at least 4 other airmen who were executed were subjected to cannibalism, as their remains were consumed by senior staff at Tachibana's ranks. The medical orderlies carried out autopsies and removed parts of the body, and then it was said it was the senior officers who indulged in acts of cannibalism. Tachibana had developed a reputation of his own during the Second World War, and he was known for being a sadistic, alcoholic commander who would order executions at the drop of a hat. The men who were executed were all beheaded by sword by Tachibana's men, and this was considered a rather medieval execution. However, the Allies would then learn of the executions of the American Airmen, and subsequently the cannibalism that occurred there also. At the time, military and international law did not deal with cannibalism, and Tachibana and 11 other Japanese soldiers and doctors were tried with the murder and prevention of honourable burial. The case was investigated in 1947 as a war crime, and 30 Japanese soldiers were prosecuted, and 4 officers were sentenced to death after being found guilty of their evil killing of the airmen. General Tachibana was one of those sentenced to death, along with Major Matoba and Captain Yoshi. Another medical officer was condemned, but he was then imprisoned instead for 8 years, like the enlisted men who were found guilty. Tachibana, on the 24th of September 1947, at the age of 57 on Guam, was brought to the gallows. He was brought into the clearing of a military prison, and there was a gallows which stood in the centre. He was led up the stairs before the executioner asked him for final words, and then he placed a cap over his head, followed by the noose. He was then shuffled over the trapdoor, and then his execution occurred very swiftly. General Yoshio Tachibana, during the Second World War, had a reputation for being a brutal alcoholic general who would order the executions and commit many crimes. Shockingly, there was a belief inside the Japanese military that consuming the human liver had medical benefits, and a vice admiral would later be executed in a separate trial exactly for this. But under Tachibana's command and control, his soldiers and men committed a number of horrific war crimes, and despite the fact there was a shortage of food, they turned to the ultimate evil after the execution of the Allied men, which in itself was unjust. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.